table, which meets on a regular basis. It includes both the nonprofit and the commercial child care operators in the province, and also urban and rural. And I must say that it's been an incredibly positive experience, and very much look forward to continuing to work with them.
The honourable member for Cape Breton South on your first supplementary.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, the short answer to that would have been no meetings with the Roundtable. Mr. Speaker, the obvious answer is none, because they have no meetings for the last 2 or 3 years. And now, as of 2 months ago, the last 2 terms of appointments for members of the Roundtable have expired. Mr. Speaker, the Roundtable included representatives from the entire daycare community, including parents and staff. And Mr. Speaker, its mandate was quite clear: to advise the Minister on improvements and enhancements to the child care delivery system in Nova Scotia. And Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister: why did the Minister have so little confidence in the Roundtable on daycare that he let the terms of its members expire?
The honourable Minister of Community Services.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure the honourable member will be pleased to know that in actual fact that I have met with the ministerial roundtable, and it was a very positive experience, and it is now evolving into a ministerial roundtable on early childhood development.
The honourable member for Cape Breton South on your final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's a strange answer to the question when the fact is that he let the terms expire of the members on the Roundtable. Mr. Speaker, the Minister needs all the help he can get when it comes to child care issues in this province. While a second federal agreement awaits the outcome of a budget vote on Thursday, this Minister still needs help, and there is still time for the Minister to establish his advisory committee on early childhood development. And Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister: will the Minister commit here today that he won't disregard the input of the new advisory committee like he has ignored the Roundtable on daycare?
The honourable Minister of Environment and Labour. The honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, first of all, I want to just point out to the honourable member that this is actually the third agreement that involves either early learning and child care, early childhood development, and now the new child care agreement that was signed yesterday with Minister Dryden. So it's the third one. We very much appreciate the input of the sector. It was great to have Elaine Ferguson there yesterday, and I would say that in my closing comments I singled her out for her incredible contribution to moving this forward in working with the sector. And Mr. Speaker, one of the things that I very much enjoy doing is working with the roundtables and the other various tables we have in place, and I will certainly continue to do that in the future.
The honourable member of Timberley Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Tourism and Culture. This government continues to heavily promote Peggy's Cove as a major tourist destination, and recent announcements about the transportation problems in that community were exceptionally well received. Yet when residents ask government to fulfill a 1993 commitment to assist with well and septic system upgrades, they are confronted daily by officials demanding immediate improvements. So my question to the Minister is your government willing to meet the obligations outlined in the February 1st, 1993 letter to Peggy's Cove residents, which I will table for the Minister's attention?
The honourable Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and through you to the member. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, I was very pleased to have the opportunity to be in Peggy's Cove a few days ago and to announce over $800,000 in improvements to the Peggy's Cove area, including that of the Visitor Information Centre, the parking area, and as well as interpretation and signage, which is very good news for the people of that area, and it comes as a result of a study which we put forward. Now, Mr. Speaker, what I will tell the member and to all members of the House that we will certainly take a look at the letter being referred to by the member. We will review it. And of course, that type of discussion would have to happen with my colleague, Minister of Service, Nova Scotia Municipal Relations.
The honourable member for Timberley Prospect on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Murray Garrison, a resident of Peggy's Cove, is currently the chair of the Peggy's Cove Commission and one of the 40-plus year-round residents of this scenic village. Mr. Garrison wants his village to receive equal treatment compared to the community of Ingonish Beach, where the municipal, provincial, and federal levels of government assisted with a $2.4 million grant for a sewage and water system. Will you, as the minister responsible for the highly promoted destination of Peggy's Cove, immediately initiate negotiations with municipal and federal officials to assist Mr. Garrison with the issue of safe drinking water in the community of Peggy's Cove?
The Honourable Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I would refer that to the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Service Nova Scotia, Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would say to the member opposite and to Mr. Garrison and to the residents of Peggy's Cove that we would be pleased to support an application for Peggy's Cove if the municipality were to put it on their priority list. We would look forward to doing that through the Municipal Rural Infrastructure Fund program that we anticipate we will be signing in the very near future to provide for services like sewer and water to communities like Peggy's Cove.
Member for Timberley Prospect on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The handoff went to the wrong member, in my opinion. On March 24th, we wrote, that is the members of the NDP, wrote to the Minister of Environment and Labour, asking him to intervene, and I will table a copy of those letters and some other information that might prove assistance to the members opposite. Environment officials have become regular tourists in the middle of the winter to Peggy's Cove, but they've offered no assistance. A letter, in fact, included in the package from a member of your staff, Peter Poole, is confrontational, not helpful, and in fact, intimidating to say the best. So I'm asking the Minister of Environment and Labour, are you prepared to host a community meeting, attend with your officials to assist the residents of Peggy's Cove with their water and their septic system problems?
Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not aware of the letter which was mentioned, so I certainly would like to see that and to review that. And the department has been working with people out around the Peggy's Cove area and will continue to work with people in the Peggy's Cove area to try and ensure that they have safe drinking water. We also work with Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations, certainly because that is the funding agency that is available for that infrastructure to be installed.
What's that? The Honourable Member Halifax Clayton Park. You have about 30 seconds.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the residents of HRM are becoming increasingly concerned about the destruction of natural lands as the city subdivisions spread out. Within HRM, there are considerable crown lands that could be preserved for the use and enjoyment of future generations. Blue Mountain Birch Cove Lakes has been identified as one of those areas. Has the Minister of Natural Resources considered the importance of preserving these lands in the urban core of HRM?
Order, please. Time allotted for question period has expired. The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I'd like to do an introduction.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased in your gallery today to be joined by the Honourable Bruce Fish. Bruce is the Minister of Energy for the province of Nova Scotia, and he's joined with me to Nova Scotia. Are you? Mr. Well, Mr. Speaker, it just highlights the type of regional cooperation we've been building on here. And, you know, it's not just electricity that can transfer borders, obviously, but Bruce, Minister Fitch and I are part of the Atlantic Power Conference, and Bruce is joined by his assistant, Ian McDonald. And I'm very pleased to welcome the Honourable Minister for the province of New Brunswick. If you'd stand with Ian and welcome. Just warm welcome to the House.
Certainly welcome these two gentlemen to the province and to the legislature. Government business, the Honourable Government House Leader.
Speaker, I move that you do now leave the chair and the House resolve the committee the whole House on bills.
Is it agreed?
Agreed. Mr. Chairman, would you please call Bill number 153, the Public Service Act?
Bill 153, the Public Service Act. I recognize the honourable member for Halifax-Chebucto.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. This is the bill that establishes the new office of Minister responsible for immigration matters. And of course, there's an incumbent who, along with his many other duties, has been assigned responsibility for this portfolio. I want to remind members that although, of course, we think it's a very good idea that such a position be established, we'd like to put on record with the Minister and with the members of this House and with the public some problems we have with how it is that this whole issue is being approached. Now, I really should emphasize this opening point, that is that having a designated cabinet position responsible for immigration matters is a big step forward. It's a big step forward in a province which has paid entirely too little attention to issues around immigration over the years. I cannot tell you how heartening it was some 6 months ago to see the Premier and several of his cabinet ministers standing up publicly on a stage down at Pier 21, a very appropriate location in Halifax given its history of association with immigration to Canada, and putting on record their dedication to seeing Nova Scotia move ahead on immigration matters. It was exactly the right thing to do. It was exactly the right thing that the Premier himself was the lead minister on making such a public statement. And now, of course, we have this Bill 153 that comes forward to manifest this intention in a concrete way in terms of a cabinet responsibility. And we have to remind ourselves that this bill goes hand in hand with a policy document that the government put out for public review in an attempt to develop a coherent strategy in Nova Scotia with respect to immigration. So, however long it's taken the government in Nova Scotia to finally come to the point of recognizing immigration as an important part of an overall economic strategy, it seems to have finally arrived there. And this is all to the good. It's all to the good that we have recognized this and are beginning to move ahead. Now, we have to remind ourselves that it is in the context of an economic strategy that the government finally arrived at this point. And that's not entirely wrong, but of course it's not the whole story either. It's certainly the case that immigration into Nova Scotia in increased numbers would be a useful step with respect to some restructuring in our economy. It has the potential, for example, to fill some unfilled jobs. Just this morning in the Economic Development Committee, we had occasion to meet with the Office of Economic Development and with representatives of NSBI. And in our discussions, naturally enough, we look at the whole range of what it is that Nova Scotia has in mind for economic development. Immigration has to be one element in that overall plan. And yet, of course, in this proposal, Bill 153, we don't see immigration made an adjunct to the Department of Economic Development. And that's an appropriate policy choice. It is an appropriate policy choice if it signifies that a broader approach is going to be taken to questions of immigration. For although it's undoubtedly the case that immigration is going to be and always historically has been a positive economic step for our province and for the other provinces that have moved ahead of us on this, there's an important cultural dimension that we ought not to lose sight of. So to a certain extent, I'm heartened that it's a minister who has a broader range of responsibilities, including some cultural responsibilities, who now gets the opportunity to include in his portfolio some responsibility for immigration. So I'm prepared in terms of faith and in terms of an initial step to give some credence to what I hope will be a very positive approach to how it is that Nova Scotia looks at immigration in the coming years. And yet I'm worried about it. I'm worried about it because it still seems that the stamp of economic necessity is all over this initiative. And we read that, I think, because it was essentially the push from the Metropolitan Halifax Dartmouth Chamber of Commerce that finally convinced the government of Nova Scotia that moving ahead on immigration matters was appropriate. And they did this because they identified positions that were going unfilled in their need to hire people for particular kinds of jobs. And given the very low birth rate that prevails here and throughout Canada, throughout North America, immigration makes a lot of sense in terms of filling some otherwise unfilled job positions. But that's the starting point. That's only the starting point. And however good it is to have identified immigration as a way forward for us economically, or part of the way forward for us economically, there has to be another dimension to it. Now, as long as we're considering the economic dimension, we should remind ourselves that the positive economic benefits are not just from filling otherwise unfilled job positions. All the studies of immigrants who have come to North America, who've come to Canada, wherever they've settled, have shown that there's a positive economic benefit that flows from their sense of self-reliance, from their sense of the need to advance their own and their family's position in life. And this is no surprise. It's no surprise that people who come forward and move from one part of the world to another are people who are going to make a success of it. We've seen this. I mean, communities in Nova Scotia that historically have been the home of large numbers of immigrants have seen this. And apart from those who are members of the Aboriginal communities, who here has not come at some point in their family ancestry from somewhere else. That's been the case for all of us. And yet, just within the last 100 years, we can identify some communities, like industrial Cape Breton, where there was an enormous influx of population who came in at a time when there were job opportunities and settled there. And we see the mosaic of the community still there in industrial Cape Breton. People who come from all kinds of different nations and who remember that fact, who haven't lost sight of that fact, who are clearly part of an interesting cultural array in industrial Cape Breton. And many small towns all over Nova Scotia have seen this as well. We've benefited from this economically, and those people have been very successful. One can look at those families and trace over generations the way in which those families have become economically successful. In the first generation, people scrabble to make a living. They do whatever comes to hand, they do whatever is necessary, even if it isn't what they might have been doing in their home nations originally. If they have to, they'll do whatever it takes in the first generation, because immigration is a multi-generational activity. For some lucky few, of course, as they come immediately, they're able to make a success of it. But mostly it's a question of 2 and 3 generations before people make a success. And they make a success in the way all of us identify it, through education. They know in the first generation that the main thing is to get some kind of work, to get something to do, to make a job for themselves or find employment, and to make sure that their children get a good education, because education is the way forward. And that's what we see. That's the pattern. That's the pattern with immigrants all over North America. It's certainly been the pattern here. So I hope that the minister, when he takes up his new responsibilities, will be mindful of this education dimension, of the fact that it's going to be necessary and it'll be helpful for those families and for our economy to have the resources in the school system so that English as a second language is available to help the children of the new immigrants. Because if those resources are not available, then they will have difficulties. They will have difficulties making a success of themselves, making a success of their families. And we don't want that. Clearly, the idea is that for them as families, for them as communities, and for Nova Scotia as a whole, the idea is that we can all benefit from making sure that the necessary instruments, tools, supports are all in place. So I have some measure of hope that the minister will see it that way and will try to make sure that ESL programs are available in appropriate communities around this province. And it shouldn't just be in Metro. It's already present in Metro, but it shouldn't just be here. It should be in the communities in which immigrants settle. So again, we see this as something of an economic tool, but always much broader than that. And the broader part is that there will be a cultural enrichment for Nova Scotia. Already we see that different ethnic groups have their own celebrations at different times of year. The ideal in Canada has not really been stated to be a melting pot. Melting pot was the term that evolved in the United States, where the ideal was stated to be that everyone would turn out to be the same, that everyone would come forward and blend in after a while, and you wouldn't be able to tell anyone apart from anyone else. There'd be no differences, no historical antecedents really thought about. Everyone would become Americans. And although to a certain extent, of course, that makes sense, and we expect that immigrants who come here will become Nova Scotians, will become Canadians, the way in which it's usually stated here is that we're interested in a mosaic. The Canadian mosaic is what it is that people talk about, in which people remember where they came from. They remember what their ancestry is. They remember whether it's English or Irish, or Scottish or Welsh or French, or if it comes from Macedonia, or if it comes from Africa, or any of the countries on the African continent, or anywhere in Asia, or anywhere in Latin or South America, that people remember where they came from and identify with that culture, ideally keep their original language over a period of generations, as well as learning the new languages. And what a useful economic tool that is for us and for them in the future, because we all remember the statement that you can buy in your own language, but you've got to sell in someone else's language. If you've got a customer in someone else in another country, then you want to speak their language. If we want to do business with China, we want people who can speak Chinese. And if we're going to be doing business with France, we want people who can speak French. And if we're going to be doing business with Mexico or any of the other countries in south of the Rio Grande, we want to be able to speak Spanish and Portuguese and have representatives of our community who can go out and do that. And naturally enough, many of those people, if we don't have advanced language programs in our schools and universities, will be people who perhaps one or two generations before might have traveled from those countries originally and come here, but kept the knowledge and memory of the cultures that they came from. Now that would be desirable. And I hope the minister, who I see nodding through some of this, not nodding off, but nodding, is taking note of this. And I hope he'll encourage his officials to put in place programs that will bear this approach in mind and that will implement the kinds of programs that are needed. So there's a cultural, although I've linked that with economics, there's a positive cultural dimension for all of us in this. It's good for Nova Scotia as a place. It makes it an interesting place to live, to have people who come here from the rest of the world. And it makes us more sympathetic and knowledgeable about international affairs. It means that we don't live entirely inward focused and in isolation. It means we don't just think about Nova Scotia politics or about Canadian politics or about North American politics, because the world is a connected place. The fact of globalization is not just a fact of economics and trade. The fact of globalization is a fact of culture and knowledge and information and connectedness about the world. And modern technologies have made this not only easy, but a fact that's impossible to avoid. So it's good for us to have in Nova Scotia as many people as possible who are linked to the rest of the world. And I'll tell the minister something about his numbers. I've pointed out before that I think they're small and that it's entirely too modest an ambition. And I'll set before the minister an even higher target than I've suggested on previous occasions. On previous occasions, I've mentioned the parallel with Manitoba. I want to remind the minister of what Canada actually accomplished 100 years ago, less than 100 years ago. 100 years ago, we were bringing in 1 million people a year. That was to a Canada. That was to a Canada that was much smaller in population than it is now. And I have to say, I see no reason why we couldn't move to 1 million people a year in Canada now. It's 250,000 already between immigrants and refugees on a national basis. Fluctuates a little bit from year to year, but that's been a fairly steady number now for about 15 or 20 years, I think, in Canada. But we could accommodate 1 million people a year in Canada. And given the fact that Canadians have such a low birth rate now, if there's going to be any appreciable chance to thicken our presence on the North American continent, this would be it. It isn't going to happen through families having more children. It's just not going to happen. And so immigration would be the way to do it. And the advantage would be, first, we would have a larger domestic market. I think Canada should target something like a population of about 50 million, accomplishable over the next 15, maybe 20 years. That would increase us from 33 to 50. That would give us a larger domestic market, and it would give us, even more importantly, a larger presence vis-a-vis the United States. Historically, there has been a ratio of about 10 to 1 in terms of population size between the United States and Canada. That's been constant over a fairly long period of time, although the United States has also had declining numbers of births, and the ratio is now something like about, I think, maybe 8.5 to 1. So we're slightly gaining on the United States. I would think that it would be desirable if we were to move ahead so that the ratio were more like 5 or 6 to 1. That would give us a greater balance, a greater presence, being beside such an enormously large and powerful neighbor. And it's not as if we had very many other neighbors. It's not as if we were France in the middle of Europe with a number of other surrounding neighbors. That isn't our situation. We have one big extended border with one big trading partner and one big presence, and that's the United States. Now, technically, there's France in Saint-Pierre-Miquelon, and there's Denmark in Greenland, and there's Russia over the North Pole, but this isn't really the presence vis-a-vis Canada the same way the United States is for us. So thickening our presence on the North American continent is, I think, an important imperative that can only be accomplished through large-scale immigration. And I hope that when the minister talks with his colleagues who hold similar positions in portfolios in other provinces and federally, which is the main locus of immigration powers, that he tries to explore this if he finds it an attractive idea. I hope he'll mull it over, and if he does, I hope he does bring something like this forward. Now, I find that the discussion, although dealing still with this combination of both economic and cultural factors, has inevitably another part of the economic dimension that we should turn our minds to. And this is the fact that a lot of the interest that Nova Scotia has, at least so far as the official immigration plan has shown itself to be so far, is in economic immigrants. The focus really is on immigrants who have $100,000, $150,000 that they can invest on their own. Now, clearly this is a good deal for us, and if people with those resources are interested in coming here, then fine. The problem is that it's a profile that I think doesn't necessarily fit what's out there in terms of the potential of who might be interested in coming to Canada. There are lots of people in every corner of the world who would be interested in coming to Canada and who, in the first or second generation, would be enormously successful regardless of whether they have managed to accumulate what in many of their home countries would be an enormously large amount of cash already. So to the extent that I worry about the proposal that I see coming forward, it has a number of points that are points that we should identify as maybe needing some rethinking. On the one hand, it's a very good thing that we're moving ahead with immigration. It's a very good thing that there's a designated cabinet post, which is what this bill is all about. It's a very good thing that the Premier has taken a personal interest. It's a very good thing that there's a draft policy. It's a very good thing that there are target numbers. On the other hand, the target numbers are really small. On the other hand, the staff assigned to it is not numerous. On the other hand, it's too heavily weighted in terms of direct focus on the category of economic immigrant. On the other hand, it could go even further. On the other hand, we worry about ESL. So I clearly this bill not only will go through, but should go through. Clearly we want the minister to have that we want a minister, and in fact this minister, to have this designation as minister responsible for immigration. But we also want the minister to take a long-range and very broad view of what it is that he's involved with here. In my constituency, which is right here on the Halifax Peninsula, I have people who come from very many diverse backgrounds. And several times a year, I am asked to go to speak to classes run by MISA, the Metro Immigrant Settlement Association, or by the Halifax Regional School Board, which runs classes in English as a second language for adults. And I go to these classes, and I meet the people, I talk with them, and I am every time impressed and astonished by how bright these people are, how keen they are on getting on with their lives and being a success in Nova Scotia, how engaged they are. And I'm impressed with how knowledgeable they are. They follow politics. I'm invited to come there to talk about provincial politics say a few words about how it differs from federal and municipal politics and what the different parties do and what are the differences and how does the House work. All those basic things that all of us are familiar with and the kinds of things that we often are invited to speak about to school groups. But here I am talking to adults who have come as immigrants or refugees to Nova Scotia, and I find it isn't like talking to kids at all. These are engaged adults who have already learned from watching TV, from reading the newspapers, from listening to the radio, a lot about politics, and they want to know. And they know about the economic system here, and they have questions. They want to know about why is something the way it is with respect to the tax system. They want to know about coalitions and minority governments. They want to know about why the voting system is the way it is compared with other things. They ask about the price of gasoline, and they ask intelligent questions about all these things. These are clearly people who are going to succeed. And if they have to scramble, they're going to scramble. And if it's their kids who will really be the ones who will go ahead, that's the way it's going to be. But we have such a small toehold on immigration. We're really beginning, but it is such a great potential for us as an area to move ahead. We know that Quebec and Manitoba have moved ahead very strongly on this, and I look forward to this government and this minister taking this new portfolio and really doing great things with it. We're certainly behind it, and we really look forward to the minister thinking about some of these points and taking a broad approach to it. Thanks very much.
Shall Clause 1 carry? I recognize the honourable member for Clayton Park. Halifax Clayton Park. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It certainly is a pleasure to have a few words today on Bill 153, which is the act which will enable the establishment of the Office of Immigration for our province. And again, as I said earlier today, this is certainly overdue. It's long overdue that we get more aggressive and more active in the role of attracting newcomers to our province and new Canadians to live in Nova Scotia. At the same time, because it's finally been done, we do applaud it. We're happy to see it happen. I have some concerns maybe about the size of the budget that's been passed and how we're moving forward. But again, the aim of establishing this office is an essential thing, and it's been a good thing to finally get moving on it. Again, we've had a need for a proper strategy for some time, and we've known the demographics for some time, recognizing that our population was aging, and that, as has been said a number of times in the House in recent months, we've certainly hit a point now where next year our birth rate will be less than the number of people who die in our province. So we know that we've suddenly hit a point where there's quite a crisis in terms of making some plans for population. And as I say, the immigration strategy is a very important component of that. It is not everything, though. We also have to look at other population impacts. We have to look at education. We have to look at retention of young people. And together, that forms a population strategy of where we go in the future. So again, we look at our population, which is about 3% of the Canadian population, and yet we get less than 1% of the immigrants here in Nova Scotia. In fact, our entire Atlantic region gets less than 3% of Canada's immigrants. And I had the opportunity to attend some of the sessions going on right now at Pier 21, and that is the Atlantic Mayors Conference on Immigration. And there are mayors and municipal councillors and RDAs and people representing communities across the Maritimes and Newfoundland that are there over the last 2 days discussing how and what kind of mechanisms we can use to advance our attractiveness and our retention ability to keep newcomers coming into our area and staying here. And the problem is widespread. And I think that it's important mentioning that conference because this is an effort that all three levels of government need to be part of. Our business community needs to be part of it, and our public need to recognize the importance and need and value of increased immigration to our area. It has a tremendous impact culturally, economically. It invigorates and creates vibrant cities. In fact, a recent publication, a book called Creative Cities, which was written by Richard Florida, and he was a speaker here last year with the Greater Halifax Partnership, speaks about the multicultural aspects of cities as being a prime indicator of of places where people, and especially young people, want to stay and work and live, because those cities are more vibrant, they offer more cultural opportunities, they have more diversity and more interest. And so it's very much to our advantage to encourage that. And I think there's almost no better example than the community of Clayton Park to say where this has been a success in Nova Scotia. And in our community, we have, unquestionably the highest percentage of new Canadians and people from other countries. I've mentioned before that at Halifax West High School, more than 50 languages are spoken, and the students there represent something like 75 different nations.
Order, please. Order, please. The member for Halifax, Clayton Park, has the floor.
Thank you very much. Again, in our community in Clayton Park, we have a strong reliance on ESL in the schools. Halifax West High School has over 80 students that are currently enrolled in some level of ESL, some of them full-time, because they are not able to be integrated fully into the other academic classes. They don't have that strong language base as yet. And that becomes a really critical need. And I have expressed my disappointment in this year's budget that both the Department of Education and the Office of Immigration have not really put aside enough money to meet the ESL needs in our province. And I'm speaking specifically in HRM because, as the Hogg report indicated, ESL is primarily needed here in HRM. There's a little bit needed in other communities, but not much. And they left it out of the funding formula because it was unique to HRM. And here in our, which is our capital and our largest population center, we do need that money in order to help us welcome and integrate and draw the newcomers fully into our society. And so I think it is the most basic of building blocks that are needed in this attraction and retention of newcomers, and to shortchange that one piece is really a pretty major downfall of the whole strategy at this point. The budget for the office as it's set up is $2.6 million, and I would be very interested to know how much of that is simply redirected funds, because we know that there were funds in the Office of Economic Development, there were some funds in the Department of Education previously, and we know that those have now been moved and centered in the Office of Immigration. But how much is new money? I'd be interested to know. It's unclear to us at this point. But I think that certainly more is needed in the language area particularly. As the office gets established, we need the business plan, because we need to find out how they're going to connect the dots. Right now, the government is doing the right thing by establishing this office. They've made a recognition of the need for some action, and I will say we are late in the game. Other provinces are way ahead of us. And I don't like to compare ourselves simply to Atlantic Canada, because Atlantic Canada has been slow to see the benefit of immigration. Now, as was mentioned, in years gone by, we've had very active, very vibrant programs to bring newcomers here. After the Second World War, we had newcomers come for farming that came from the Netherlands. And we see today 2 of our MPs from Nova Scotia are the sons of those immigrants who came post-war to farm in Nova Scotia and have done very well, and clearly their children are contributing greatly to our society today. Earlier on, if you go back 100 years, Canada had a policy that would attract Canadians to fill the West, because we built an expensive railroad and we had no people and no freight. And they attracted thousands, in fact millions of people from Northern Europe and Russia to fill the West. And that was extremely successful. In that case, the newcomers were offered property. They were given land in order to come. They were actually given a stake in the new country to come and contribute. And again, having lived out west, I can tell you that the impact of their culture is still very visible in cities like Winnipeg, Edmonton, Calgary, and so on. And their culture is still maintained, their language is still spoken, and so it's an example, as was said earlier, about the mosaic that we treasure here across the country. But provinces like Ontario have been a mecca for the newcomers, and they've dealt with and developed programs really to help integrate and to support those waves of immigration that are far advanced from what we have here in Nova Scotia. Mr. Chair. Certainly in the Clayton Park riding again.
Order, please. There's getting to be quite a little buzz in the chamber here. The honourable member for Halifax, Clayton Park, has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to speak about the office and our expectations for that office. And I think all of us can say we have high expectations. I really don't want to see an office that does research. I'll be quite frank. We have other offices that we fund, and they do a lot of nice academic research, and they gather data and that sort of thing. I think what we have to be clear about is we need programs and plans. We need programs that work with all those partners that I referred to. The 3 levels of government have to be involved. If we're going to be successful, we have to make sure that our municipalities provide the kind of services that are going to support those newcomers. And in fact, today at the conference that's being held, they were having a panel which included police and fire service, medical services, basic city services. How can our city governments or our town governments interface and look after the needs of newcomers? We have to recognize cultural and language difficulties, sometimes barriers, and we have to make sure that at that municipal level, the red carpet is rolled out and that they understand and know how to deal with some of the differences that will arise. And I think it's very important that be addressed. And again, some of the most successful examples of immigration have very much included the business community, because we know that people who arrive have to have a place to work. They have to have a sense that their skills are recognized. They have to be integrated. So again, it's important that they become partners. And we know we're facing a skill shortage. This is not a question of making room where there isn't any room or there is no money. This is a question of anticipating the needs that we have and helping people with those skills to make Nova Scotia their home and fill a very dramatic need that we have. And in the next 10 years, we expect that there will be 50,000 jobs unfilled in our province. And a lot of those are skilled workers that we're missing today. And I know that the Department of Education does some work on that as well in anticipating the job needs. But we do need to help people be integrated, to attend our educational institution, to get Canadian qualifications and credentials. So all of those things are important. As I say, I think that it's very important that we look for solid projects, programs that will be introduced that will absolutely have an impact. And we'll be looking very carefully for the business plan that comes forth. The funding for that office, again, is allowing for less than 11 new positions. I think it's 10.5 new positions. Really, that's not a very large staff, and we have some high expectations. So I would ask the government to consider that they perhaps increase that budget and put more new money in it rather than recycling some of the old that's been moved over there. We need to expand it as soon as those programs are identified and known. So we'll give them a little time to prepare that. As it was mentioned, we have certainly economic benefits, but we should also not turn our backs on those that are refugees who come here with either government or private sponsorship. I think that Nova Scotians are willing to assist and open their doors to newcomers who need help. And the idea of having more sponsored refugees and humanitarian immigration is important as well, and we need to keep that as part of that debate, as part of the tenor of our discussion. It isn't all about firing up our economy and new people coming in to buy new homes. It's also about helping people establish lives here in our province. And they will create very, very vibrant communities that enrich us all. And as I say, I would welcome members of the House to visit Clayton Park or to visit our schools, because they are truly an example of a wonderful cultural diversity that has come to represent our community, and we're very proud of it. And that's happened in about a 15-year span. It has not always been so, and the growth and the new home sales and so on in that area are largely fueled by newcomers to Nova Scotia. And I think it's something that, as I say, that our community has definitely adopted and in fact celebrates, and it's become the character of our neighborhoods. We've got a new Islamic center in that area. We have a very vibrant Lebanese community who have only recently launched a Lebanese-Canadian Chamber of Commerce to improve trade links between ourselves and Lebanon. They've had only their first couple of meetings. They in fact, had their first lunch just very recently. And that, again, will have tremendous impact and benefit. We can, work with their language and cultural ties to Lebanon and help to extend our own exporting, which I might add, we're very far behind the rest of Canada, a recent study showed, in terms of export activity. So many, many communities are being fostered there. The largest wave of newcomers now are from Korea, and that's a country I actually had the opportunity to live in for 3 years in the early 80s, and I can attest to their industriousness and friendliness. Very open and warm people, and I think that we will find their contribution to our province tremendous. And I think that people will begin to notice that very soon, as we did actually at the launch of the announcement of the new Minister of Immigration, where some of the entertainment was provided by a very young boy who played the violin just beautifully. And he is a newcomer from Korea. So, you know, we can see the evidence of this around us every day here in the capital city. And I think it's important not to leave out the impact of rural Nova Scotia. I do believe we have to deal with reality. Most newcomers will look for an urban center, but many also want to have the kind of quality of life that would come from a smaller community. So I'd welcome that as well. Certainly, as I say, I guess I'd like to certainly conclude my remarks by saying that it's the right thing to do to establish this office. We need to ensure that it's properly resourced, that its mandate is clear, and that some really concrete programs come out of this so that the other partners involved, the municipalities, business community, the general public, and our federal government can get on board and work together to make this happen. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Shall Clause 1 carry? Shall Clause 2 carry? I understand the member for Halifax Clayton Park has an amendment.
It is Clause 2, 25L2 on the second page. That's the amendment that I have.
Perhaps the honourable member would be kind enough to distribute that for all members of the committee.
Yes, let's do that. Could we get you to pass this out? No. The amendment that is proposed, would you like me to speak to that?
Well, perhaps it would be important to read it into the record, and the member is certainly entitled to give her dissertation.
Just a little explanation, I think, because it's not a major change. I have shown this change to the Minister of Immigration and also to the NDP critic for immigration. And essentially what this does is ensure that when, in this Clause 2, it speaks of the Minister of Immigration receiving or submitting an annual report to the Executive Council, and the clause below says that that same report would be tabled here at the Assembly. And what I'm asking is that it be tabled, so that the clause that's changing is Clause 2, where we delete within 15 days of the next sitting and substitute file it within 15 days with the clerk of the Assembly. That way the report would be available to all members of the House through the clerk's office, and we would not have to wait perhaps 6 months or longer to get the annual report. That's all it is a reporting amendment. Thank you.
I recognize the Honourable Minister responsible for immigration.
Chairman, certainly we have no problem with this amendment, and I thank the member for sharing with me in advance. And I appreciate the members from both parties with regards to their comments. The member from Halifax, Shabakto, as well. And we have no problem with this moving forward.
On the amendment, shall the amendment carry? Shall the clause as amended carry? Shall the bill, or shall the title carry? Shall the bill carry? Shall the clauses carry? Sorry. And shall the title carry? Carry. Okay. Okay. Right here.
Thank you, Rick. Recognize the Government House Leader.
Mr. Chair, would you please call Bill 168, the Securities Act?
I'd like to call Bill number 168, the Securities Act. And I'll recognize the Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chair, I'd like to stand up and say a few words on Bill 168 because it's an interesting bill at this point, because it's a bill that they call it, basically it gives registrants a passport in and out of various provinces, that they can, if you're in Ontario, for instance, that you can work in Nova Scotia and vice versa. And I think it bears putting some, even in committee of the whole, putting some thoughts on the record, because the idea of this, while it is a bill that's, if you want to put it in a certain phrase, that's companioned across the country, and it's to mirror other legislation that would bring these security acts together, is of and by itself probably a worthy bill. But, you know, what we have to be cognizant of is a couple of things. One, as I mentioned on second reading, is this bill a real chance that will raise the bar or lower the bar? And we really, it's not evident in this in this bill yet, and we would like to see that, because you know, today more than ever, we have a large amount of our citizens dabbling in investment funds. We see that time preceding when we file our income tax, we're inundated with advertisements to buy mutual funds and to buy RRSPs and so on. And you know, for a lot of consumers, it's much like buying a pig in a poke, because we really don't know what we're buying. And a lot of people say, hey, this is a good way of kind of deferring some taxes for a later period in life. And it's a last minute process, and many would tell you it's not a very wise process to do it that late in the game. The reality of what we should be doing around our investments, if we're looking at them in view of a retirement fund, is it has to be looked at with the long view, because what we do is merely to say we're going to invest to defer tax payment is not very a wise decision to make, Mr. Chair, because the fact is that where you may be gaining, say, in the taxation years just past 04, you may be detaining a deferment, but you may also be buying a bunch of worthless junk that you find what you save in income tax you lose in the market.
Had a good year, did you, Frank?
And not as good as some others. I was being chided here if I had a good year. Well, you know, I've had better, and I've had worse. But you know, the fact of the matter is, and my colleague from Halifax, Shabukto, spoke on second reading regarding mutual funds, and I do not pretend to have the expertise around mutual funds as that member does. But I'm if I don't have his expertise, I'm starting to have a mutual admiration of my hate for mutual funds, as he does. So, Mr. Chair, these are items that have to be. This makes this bill, at this juncture in a lot of people's lives, extremely important, because whether we agree the style of investment is not what's at debate here today, Mr. Chair. What we're talking about is the securities, and indeed the security of the securities. That we've got to make sure that we invest these funds and that the Nova Scotian consumer is having the best possible protection when it comes to investment of these funds, and that you know, for the want of whether it's the registrant who owns it or a broker, however you want to use the term, that person is reliable and it sets out a course of probably bars that they have to meet to make sure that we have that they're protecting the consumer. Now, you know, when we allow the registrant to move from province to province, and it makes that industry more pliable, it seems, well, this is a good thing. You know, we've got access on the surface. It appears we have access to more and more people in which to engage in investment. Well, that isn't necessarily so. Because what may happen now is large firms that would have offices in Nova Scotia may say, look, you know, we don't need to have a Nova Scotia-based firm anymore. We'll just move everything to Bay Street, and we'll do it from there. And what we affect is lose those jobs here. And so that would be, I say, is an extreme negative, Mr. Chair. As I mentioned earlier, a possible one of the upsides is that the investor, the wise investor, then would be able to shop the country for the broker they would see that they would gain the most value from. So that's the upside of it. You know, in this bill, we talk about the labor capital funds and some changes, which I believe are by and large good, but which allows the commission, if you will, the ability to go in and take charge of those funds, rather than in the old system would have to shut those funds down and then have liquidate everything, as opposed to what we're going to be able to do through this bill is get in and if you will, I'll use my own terminology, is freeze that set of capital, and rather than shut it down, make sure that it's working properly, and that the people that are running that fund are running it in a fair and honest proposal, Mr. Chair. So that's another issue that's in here that's positive. But I want to get back to something I touched on earlier, Mr. Chair, and that is, as consumers, more and more average Nova Scotians, if you want to use that term, are in the market today, are playing some sort of market-driven game, whether it's mutual funds or bonds and the currency market or whatever. But they're in there and investing, and some are doing it on their own. It's through whether it's self-directed RRSPs or a self-directed fund, that they're doing it on their own, and some I hear are doing fairly well. But many consumers rely on some form of brokerage house or some sort of investor group, and that these people often are full-range financial planners, Mr. Chair. And a lot of what you're seeing done today with financial planners, they'll take you a whole basket of goods for you in the financial markets. I mean, we've really seen an explosion since the early 90s of the intrusion of insurance companies into the banking industry. We keep hearing, you know, are we going to see bank mergers of a substantial size? And I'm sorry to say that I think that's going to happen, and I don't think that's going to be good for consumers. But the fact being that what we have with a lot of these insurance companies now that are in it, like I think the Mutual Group is one. Mutual is now have basically a banking system called Mutual One, which there's no bricks or mortar to this bank, and you can buy this service and through Mutual One, and you can do all your financial dealings through there, and there's no teller, there's no billing. You enter, you just do it all through either the internet or through such things as an ATM card, but there's really no place to go to. So we as consumers have to be leery of this. Now, I'm not saying that system with Mutual is a bad system per se, but what it is, we're looking at a whole new way of doing something. It's a burst of a new product in an area that is kind of foreign to a lot of our citizens. So, you know, we have to look and say, you know, how does a bill like 168 impact on those type of obligations? It doesn't exist as a there's no, what I would say, registrant, as it says in here. There's no broker you deal with. You just deal with maybe on an 800 level, you may call an advisor or more than likely a call center and just ask some questions. And the market itself, by virtue then, is very liquid. You very seldom see a check or anything. It's all electronic. And I don't see where 168 addresses that, and I would have liked to have seen it. I would like to have seen that, and I realize the intent of the bill, but it's something that a much larger bill, with a much larger scope, should have been considered. I mean, this is not an offensive bill by itself. And my reason for standing in my place is not to say that this bill has a tremendous amount of problems. It has a few small problems, but my intention is to speak on why, where we're living at today in an electronic world, and, the idea of... Oh, certainly.
To allow for an introduction, recognize the honourable member for Kings North.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. I introduce to this Assembly someone who really needs no introduction, who's sitting in the Speaker's gallery, who has been in this House more years than most of us here. We welcome George Moody and ask him to stand.
Indeed, welcome to our visitors in the gallery today. Thank you, honourable member. You have the floor again.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and my welcome to Mr. Moody, who was a fine member, and many of us. I had just a short time, as you did, Mr. Chair, sitting. Well, if you were as good as Mr. Moody, I would. But we had the pleasure, you and I, Mr. Chair, of sitting in the House, I think about approximately the same amount of time with Mr. Moody, and a great deal of respect for him. But I want to get back to talking about 168, and as I said before the introduction, that it's a bill that it's not an offensive bill. It's a bill that has some probably small holes in it that can be fixed. But the fact is that we should be debating much larger ideas around how the financial institutions of today work. Now, one could easily say, well, that's an issue more properly to be debated in the federal House and not in this House, and to some degree that is right, but not entirely, because what we have to do is look at the consumer's perspective and our obligations as provincial representatives to protect consumers, because in this era of the idea that we walk up to a wicket and we sign a deposit check or a deposit slip and we deposit our money, is becoming less and less, and whether it's our lifestyles that are causing this, and it's the financial institution that's reacting to it and saying, we're going to give you these services over and above this now because we realize that you can't access our building between these hours, and they don't feel that it's financially appropriate for them to keep the buildings open extraordinary hours. But again, that's a whole other debate, because it's a debate around consumers having access to financial institutions, and what we've saw here in Nova Scotia, in particular in rural Nova Scotia, is the withdrawal, if I can use that kind of play on words, Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair, of banking services from many of our small communities, and these are lifelines for a lot of our seniors and people on fixed income in particular, and we've seen them replaced in corner stores with ATMs, and which really don't really fit the requirements of a lot of these people, and some people are still don't have proper access to broadband and the security that would go with broadband to allow them to do internet banking. So we should be here debating the fullness of the package around what is good for the consumer public when it comes to financial services. But we have in this bill an idea that, we need the openness of our borders from British Columbia to Newfoundland, for the movement of this these type of transaction, and it's a flow of cash is what it is, Mr. Chair. So what we would like to see is in here. If I wanted to talk about one of the loopholes, and it would be that if there was a backstop here in some way, that we wouldn't see that this be injurious to the financial industry that's here in Nova Scotia, that we could get assurances that, you know, these brokers that exist here today will be able to stay, and you know, that it won't be lost because of this bill, that business that is done, you know, whether it's on up and down George Street outside of here, and many of the large banking buildings, and indeed this whole kind of block around Province House, where most of the main financial institutions for the province are, Mr. Chair, that this would be protected, that we would see people allowed to stay here and perform those duties for the people that need them the most. That we don't see what we've seen in the banking industry is a retreat from rural areas, because that's what this bill could cause. And the province itself is kind of a microcosm for the country, that they've retreated from rural Nova Scotia, the banking industry, and have consolidated in larger areas. Well, indeed, then with this bill, what you may see with brokers and so on, that they would see that they would retreat from smaller rural provinces like Nova Scotia. You may see them go to Montreal or to Toronto or Edmonton or Vancouver, and we would lose them in these areas. So that's what I would have liked to have seen. So, you know, that these types of bills, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to take my place shortly, but these types of bills are like an important first step in kind of bringing in the new age of securities and of banking, although this doesn't deal directly with banking, as I said, but it has to be, I think at some point, it's incumbent upon the minister responsible to bring forward a more comprehensive bill that is truly linked to today's markets, where we have many more consumers buying and actively trading in funds, and how those trades are being enacted, whether it's through a phone line or through the internet or through various, maybe just a personal out of wicket again, which is a dying thing. So that's what I would like to see at some point. Insurance, that this would be, you would see almost like, we would like to see almost like an omnibus bill that would deal with securities and really bring us into this millennium when it comes to ensuring that people have real and unfettered access to the movement of their own personal capital, plus that the barriers around that would protect them, and that they would be operating in a secure environment for various reasons. But, Mr. Speaker, I look forward for Bill 168 going forward, and I'm quite happy to have the time to put these remarks on the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I recognize the member for Halifax-Shabukto.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much. I agree with absolutely everything said by my colleague from Cape Breton Centre. I suppose at this point I could just take my seat, but I think I do wish to elaborate just a little bit on his main point. His main point, of course, being that the consumer should come first when it comes to questions of securities law in our province. And I see, in fact, that we have two bills in front of us that deal with securities law, some tidying up of the legislation. We have Bill 168, which we're focusing on now, and a companion piece, Bill 205. Now, I want to confess, I think, to not paying so much attention to the formal regulatory regime for securities in the province of Nova Scotia as perhaps I ought to have in the past. In 1998, when I was first elected to this House, I fulfilled the function of being critic for finance on behalf of my party. And during that time, I think during the year and a half or so that I was critic for that portfolio, I did have occasion to meet with the chair and officials of the Securities Commission that Nova Scotia has, and discussing some of the issues that they identified at the time. In the political climate of the moment, it seemed clear to me that there wasn't a necessity really to focus on what it is that was going on there. As we all know, Nova Scotia itself does not really have very many companies that trade publicly, and this isn't really a big regulatory field for Nova Scotia. In fact, I think I'd better put on the record immediately that I own no Nova Scotia securities. This is a choice. This is a matter of choice. I own no Emira and I own no Alliant. I own no Empire, I own no Seamark, I own no Etruscan, whatever the 20 or 22 companies are that trade publicly in Nova Scotia, I own none of them, not because I'm prohibited by law from owning them. And I'm very much aware that, of course, there's disclosure that's required every year, and that there's a public scrutiny function that is performed by putting these things on the official record. But I choose for myself not to buy any Nova Scotia securities, so that, in fact, no question will ever arise with respect to the independence of my judgment when it comes to regulatory matters that might touch on any of these companies in any way. And that extends as well to companies that are not publicly traded. For example, as I suppose other members of this House, I've been invited by people who have enterprises of one sort or another to invest in their enterprise. And I don't do it if it's a Nova Scotia company. For example, there are some companies that are going into the business of generating wind energy in Nova Scotia. I highly approve, and I think they'll probably do well, but I wouldn't put any money into it, not because I didn't think it wouldn't do well, but because I refuse for myself to be involved in any kind of investment that would even conceivably lead to any kind of conflict of interest on the floor of this legislature, which is where we come to protect the interests of consumers. And that's our focus in the end, is to protect the interests of consumers. So I'm not making a statement there about not paying attention to the securities framework in Nova Scotia because I don't happen to have investments in Nova Scotia companies. That isn't the issue. The issue is that it didn't seem front and center in terms of what it is that we needed to do back in '98 or perhaps now. And yet at the same time, there is a real reason to turn our minds to how it is that we protect consumers. Now, I'm not entirely convinced that either this bill or its companion piece of legislation really does that. And I made comments to that effect in second reading, and I'm going to raise some additional points today. My colleague from Cape Breton Centre made the main and fundamental point, which is that when we turn our minds to this, we should be turning our minds not so much to the issue of making life easier and more convenient for the profession. We should be turning our minds to what it is that will safeguard the consuming public, that is, the public that is involved in making investments to secure their future and the future of their families. Now, unfortunately, it just doesn't seem to me that that's the focus of these bills. Now, it may be that there will be more legislation to come. It may be that there will be other forms of actions taken to make sure that the needs and interests of the consumers are put front and center. And it may be that this is a certain amount of clearing of the underbrush. It may be that we can regard Bills 168 and its companion piece 205 as tidying up some of the odds and ends around in our legislation. And I understand fully that Bill 168 is a piece of what's called uniform legislation. I understand fully that a bill in I think exact terms is probably in front of each of the legislatures around the country. And the idea is, of course, that the ministers and their advisors, having worked out a particular problem, want to make sure that there is a reciprocating framework put in place in order to make life easy for those who sell securities to be able to take their credentials from one province and move around and do that job in other provinces. And this makes a certain amount of sense. We're all familiar with the idea of uniform legislation in a variety of contexts. This comes up in different branches of the law, and it's a good idea, and there are models for it, and it makes sense. But again, what does it do for the consumers in this case? It's not at all clear that the needs of the consumers are being protected. And I gave, when I spoke last on second reading, some examples of how it is that the needs of the consumers have to be addressed. I gave examples of where it is that we would want to see the minister responsible for the Securities Commission, the minister who has some responsibility for looking out for the needs of the consumers who are involved in financial instruments to have additional protection. And I had hoped that in the intervening couple of weeks we might have heard something more publicly from the ministers and the government about where it is that they plan to go on this, but we haven't. I don't think I've missed it. I'm hoping that this will come. I know everyone's been busy. I know there's a busy legislative agenda. I know the minister is concerned about these particular bills that are in his portfolio, and he's trying to get through the House, that he has to pay attention to that. But surely some signal should come that this is a concern of the government and that they are going to take up, either on their own or in conjunction with their colleagues around the nation, the necessity of making sure that the public that buys the instruments that the people for whom we are making life easier are going to be selling. That's what we're doing here in Bill 168. We're making life a little easier for those people who are going to be selling mutual funds. But it's the customers that I want to make life a little easier for and whose interests really need to be protected. I gave examples of ways in which mutual funds are a very dubious investment in the first place when I spoke at second reading. I'm going to carry on a little bit with some of this problem, because this is a big difficulty. I think probably all of us here and many other Nova Scotians are involved in contemplating their financial futures. One does this all the time. And you do it for two main reasons. One is you do it for your own retirement, and the other is you do it in order to secure something for your children, usually particularly looking towards the expensive time of when they go on to post-secondary education if they do, or otherwise getting them started in life. So people plan, they think about this sort of stuff. When kids are born, if people have a few dollars, they're happy to try and put them aside. And the Government of Canada has various vehicles for trying to encourage people to put money aside, and they match a certain amount, and they help people, and there are certain tax benefits. And I know many people do this. They put their money aside for their children as over against the time they might need that money for their post-secondary education. And what do? They buy mutual funds. That's mostly what they do, because they don't know what else to do. They don't really know that they might be able to make their own investments or their own investment choices, and if they did, they're a little worried that they might not do the right thing, so they look for professional advice. And it's the same story when it comes to one's retirement. People do the same thing. They try and put a few dollars aside if they can on their own, and of course there are tax benefits for doing this with RRSPs. Any money that's sheltered in an RRSP comes off your income. You don't pay tax on it until you withdraw it, and so on. Everyone's familiar with this kind of arrangement. And if one's lucky enough to work in a place where there's a pension plan of some kind, then money goes into that, and savings are being made towards the day of retirement. But where's that money invested? If one has an RRSP or if there's a registered pension plan, what's happening to that money? Now, sometimes that money's in bonds, more often it's in stocks, but you know what? Mostly, a lot of this money goes into mutual funds. The professional advisors who either deal with individuals or deal with pension funds often pool the money. And that's what mutual funds are. They're ways of pooling the money, so that instead of having $1,000 or $5,000 or $50,000 or $100,000 or whatever one is fortunate enough to have as an individual, that money's pooled with other individuals' savings and their employers' contributions if they have some, and there's a larger heft in the marketplace. It makes a certain amount of sense in theory, until you actually look at the performance, until you actually look at the fees. So this is problematic. And if people want to make their own decisions, it's hard, it's difficult. It's difficult for people to make their own individual choices about bonds or about individual stocks or groupings of stocks. And even if people want to make choices about mutual funds, that's also hard. And lots of people shy away from this. So there has to be a framework of safeguards. There has to be a framework of openness. There has to be a framework of security for people. And I don't mean to suggest that there are none. Clearly, we have accountants. Clearly, there are disclosure rules. Clearly, securities and exchange commissions are alive to issues of insider trading, of full disclosure, of the appropriateness of numbers. And yet, of course, problems turn up all the time. All the time. You can't open the financial pages of the newspaper on any given day without finding the bad news about some company somewhere where they've been cooking the books. In today's Financial Post, there's a little column by Mr. Rosen, who writes regularly for the Financial Post on accounting matters. And he's got an interesting column today about income trusts. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but I've done pretty darn well in the market in the last year, and some of my investments have been in income trusts, I'm happy to say. I'm a happy man this year. Good year. But you know what? And I hear the finance minister saying you can't count on it on into the future. Well, you can't count on anything on into the future, and I'm glad to hear the finance minister expressing some skepticism, and I hope his skepticism is not just with respect to income trusts. I hope he's skeptical about the whole of the economy, because I am. I got to tell you for sure that it's fine to do well at some point, but I worry when I look long term, and I think there are good solid reasons to be worried when you look long term. But what I'm turning to here is an interesting little accounting problem that I wasn't really aware of till I read this column today. And here's what he says. Here's what Mr. Rosen says in his column today. He says that, well, income trusts have done quite well, and when people pick them, they often pick them according to what's called yield. Everyone knows what yield is. The question is, what's the stock price and what's the dividend? And you have a multiple, and you look at this, and you find that there's a good yield or a bad yield, and maybe you're going to choose a stock based on that. But as he points out, there's an interesting little accounting problem in income trusts, and it has to do with a little line called distributable cash. And what he points out is that accounting rules don't seem to have a nailed down definition of what distributable cash actually should mean for income trusts, and therefore, even when disclosure, as required by the Securities and Exchange Commissions, is in place, it's hard to get a good, solid, reliable, sound feel for exactly how the company is doing, because there is some wiggle room. And haven't we heard lots about wiggle room in accounting in big corporations to our sorrow universally across North America in the last few years? And aren't there some CEOs and CFOs and others involved on trial, and a number of them found guilty and ending up in jail where they deserve to be, but with enormous losses for the investing public? It's fine that these people end up in jail, but you know what? Cure isn't good enough. It's prevention that we're interested in. It's prevention and a healthy system and a transparent system and a clear system, because surely that's what the market is premised on. The market is premised on good information being available to everybody on an equal basis, and that it be good information, reliable, solid information. So I don't think there's a happy solution to how anybody makes their investments. I put on record before that I own no mutual funds. I do my own picking. I'm happy to rely upon my own judgment of where investments ought to be made. So far, I'm happy with the results. If the results are no good, I'll live with the consequences. That's up to me. But most people aren't prepared to do that. Most people need some protection here because most people are going to be buying into mutual funds. So I'm not making a personal plea here because I don't touch them. What I'm asking is that the government turn its mind to this problem of protecting all those thousands of people in our province who are out there trying their best to save and invest for their retirement and for the education and future of their children. So I join with my colleague from Cape Breton Centre in looking at this bill, at its companion bill, and indeed in looking back on 7 years of legislation that hasn't come to this House dealing with securities, and I'm wondering why not. Now we know that the industry itself is starting to respond a little bit to the complaints of consumers about just how high the management expense fees are. They're starting to adjust a little bit, and there have been a few articles in the financial pages of the newspapers in which they've identified some companies that are starting to moderate their rates a little bit. Yet they're still much higher in Canada than they are in the United States, and they're still much higher than they need to be or ought to be. And the trouble with those fees, of course, is that the professional managers who get those fees are paid first right off the top. In other words, the fund has to return on the investments, something close to 3% every year to pay the managers before you, the investor, get anything. So this is highly problematic. Is it an appropriate problem for regulation? Well, I think it is, because if you think about how you deal with problems that come forward, we always have options. One option is the criminal law. Now criminal law is federal, but so it doesn't really come within our purview to deal with that. The other is quasi-criminal or regulatory matters, and we can deal with that. That's a provincial matter. And indeed, I want to make sure, and I think this is part of the thrust of this bill, that there is an appropriate level of penalty or its companion to make sure that there's an appropriate level of penalty, that is to say a disincentive, in place for anyone who might be playing fast and loose with the rules. So that's part of the safeguards. But it's not the only one. Criminal and regulatory offenses are not the only way to go here. What I'm asking the government to think about is whether it isn't time to think in an organized way about regulating the fees or taking marketplace activity in order to try to put pressure on those who sell these instruments to lower their fees. Because unless we stand up and say publicly that we object and we don't like it and we're not going to take it anymore, it's going to continue. It's fine for me, as one member of this legislature in the opposition, to say this, and I hope people in the industry will pay attention and take note and understand that there is a strong feeling amongst the public in reaction to how it is that they operate in the marketplace. And that if I've identified this problem, and if there is, as I pointed out before, a book by Mr. John Reynolds that's been published this year that lays out the details of what's wrong with the Canadian mutual fund industry, then clearly there's a groundswell out there. The problem's been identified, people are talking about it, investors will begin to rebel, and there's nothing like marketplace pressure in order to get something going. That would be wonderful. But there's also room for the responsible ministers, those whose job it is to superintend securities commissions or to stand up for consumers, to begin to say the same kind of thing, to say it publicly, and to consider whether there isn't room to regulate those fees. So I hope that the discussions we've had at second reading and now in committee of the whole House about where it is that regulations ought to go on securities will begin to have an effect. I hope that the minister responsible, who I heard speak on a previous occasion to say that he'd heard what was said, will actually take action, and that those words won't be formulaic, that they won't simply be, I hear you. I hear you is a good starting point. I'm going to do something about it would be even more welcome. So with those comments, Mr. Chair, I'm happy to say that we'll certainly be supporting, as we did on second reading, this legislation, but we're certainly, now that we're alive to this problem, going to be looking for a lot more from this government. Thank you very much.
Thank you, member. Is the House ready? Yes. Shall the clauses carry? Shall the title carry? Shall the bill carry? It's carried. Recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, would you please call Bill number 173, the Industry Act?
Bill number 173, the Bee Industry Act, and I'll recognize the Honourable Member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm glad to have a few minutes to speak on the Bee Industry Act. This piece of legislation, I think, is probably due, maybe overdue, in terms of the changing world we live in, and in terms of the changing world that the industry is in. I think we could all maybe have had some contact with someone who was a beekeeper, and certainly at one time in my life I made an attempt at growing strawberries, about an acre or so, and required bees for the pollination of those flowers, and asked a friend of mine, actually a colleague who was another teacher, and actually had been my teacher when I was considerably younger, and his name is Gary Smeltzer, and some may recognize his father. Right, it's Smeltzer's Honey. And some may recognize his father. I think Jerry Smeltzer was his name, and so well known, certainly in the valley. And so it seemed to be a fairly innocuous event if you could find a beekeeper and ask them if they would allow, or if they would come and use your site as a site for their to collect nectar and for the bees to make honey. So, but Mr. Chair, the world, if it was that simple, I guess it would be great. But there are a lot of concerns for the industry, by the industry, and they worry. I think because mostly, I think in particular, because most of the queen bees that are required for the generation of hives are imported, then quite often those bees would come from jurisdictions or come from areas where there would be a particular disease, and then you would contaminate the local beehives, and bees don't, bees don't stay necessarily in the same place, which is one of their attributes. And it takes, you have to have a temperature of about 20 degrees Celsius to get it warm enough for bees to be able to fly. So, and I would say they'd be quite inactive in the last few days. But this actually, all these things add to the cost. I mean, the more that you extend the winter, then the more that the beekeepers have to supply sugar or whatever they're using, for the bees to feed on to keep the hive alive. And the more, the colder the winters, the more severe the winters. Obviously, the energy supply is greater. And if winter lasts long enough, quite often the losses will be significant. And then it's the whole problem of trying to take a small number of bees and split them up and try to generate more hives, which requires more queens, and et cetera, et cetera. But a queen is worth about $21. In other words, to purchase a queen is about $21, and a working hive would be about $300. And in a good year, a hive would produce about 130 pounds of honey, a single hive. But last year actually wasn't a good year, and hives produced 40 to 50 pounds. So you're looking at down by a third roughly. There are a couple of diseases, and actually that gets kind of to the core of the necessity for this piece of legislation, Mr. Chair, and that is the ability to prevent the bringing in of diseased bees. And because number one, the bill allows for the registry of beekeepers. So if you're going to keep bees in this province, you have to register. But also, if you're going to import bees into the province, then you have to get a permit. And it's that permitting process that would allow the Department of Agriculture, number one, to ensure that the bees you're going to import come from a jurisdiction where there's no disease, or you can qualify the quality of the bees that you want to bring in. And actually, there's 2 or 3 diseases. There's European and American foul brood, which affects the young bees, and thought to be brought on by stress. And there is varroa mite is another disease, and there are really a couple of drugs that can be used to slow down or eliminate these diseases. But the problem in terms of the varroa mite is that the drug called checkmate, you only get about 2 years. In about 2 years, the bees are resistant to the drug, and you can well imagine that the companies that would produce these drugs, a fair bit of money, a fair bit of investment, a fair bit of time going into the development of these drugs for a relatively small market, number one. So therefore, there's not a great incentive for drug companies to be producing drugs for the prevention of or the control of these diseases, and therefore the industry is fairly limited in the drugs that it can use. In terms of American foul brood, they just recommend that you burn everything that you have, your hives and so on, because elimination of it that's pretty much just to destroy everything you have is how you get rid of it. The New Brunswick, Alberta, and some parts of Ontario, the bees have developed resistance to these drugs, and this would be, in terms of this legislation, Mr. Chair, these would be areas that the province would be, somewhat concerned if people were going to import bees, that they're going to bring in the resistance to the drugs, and and also the possibility of the varroa mite. I guess the industry is rightly concerned. They were concerned about this legislation, but seem to be in quite a bit of support. And the minister has guaranteed to me that there's no fee for the registering of beekeepers, and I would see that as an important thing. If this is going to be one of those another way to strap on a user fee to a very tiny part of the agricultural sector, and actually an important part, because ask any of the blueberry growers, what their chances, what the difference is in their crop if they bring in bees or they just rely on wild bees to pollinate, and you're going to get a fair difference in the quality and the quantity of the crop produced. And we know that there are enough other complications in producing any of these crops. If we have a late frost that affects the blossoms, if you have a drought, et cetera, then all these things are going to impact the quantity of the crop. And so pollination is an important factor for flowering plants. And so having lots of bees to do this has been known to be worthwhile to a variety of sectors that have blossoming plants to produce fruit. So I think that when I consider that there are people who have an interest in apiculture or the keeping of bees, that and they're not thinking of commercial operations. They're thinking of having a couple of hives or 5, and these people are interested in producing their own honey, and these people are going to have to register. If anybody who's keeping bees is going to have to register under this legislation, and I don't have a problem with that. And I think it's for that reason that I'm glad that the minister confirmed that there won't be any fee to register, because I can see that there will be a lot of people who will not register, and that will defeat the whole purpose of this legislation. The purpose of this legislation is to get all the beekeepers registered and have them aware of the legislation and also the possible dangers of bringing in bees from jurisdictions where they could bring in disease. And that's what this is supposed to control or get a handle on, so that beekeepers will have a clean environment, and that we won't be bringing in disease that will impact the industry here. So that means big or small, everybody has to have a buy-in and understand that the world in which they're dealing. And I think it's a very good step, because I can see lots of small operations who would not be interested in being involved in this at all. And it's going to take a little work to get a buy-in as it is, but if you attach a fee to that, Mr. Minister, then you're definitely not going to get them. And then you're not going to have any idea of how many people are actually out there doing this, and the whole issue around disease control will be for naught. So I want to say that my party and my colleagues support this. It seems that it's supported within the industry, and I expect that the industry things will change a bit over time, and I want to assure the minister that we'd be interested if the industry is looking at changes in this legislation in a year or whatever, that we will definitely try to be flexible in that regard, whatever seems to work. And but I think the thrust of the legislation is good, and I can only assume that in the long run it'll be better for all beekeepers, and actually all those involved in the horticulture sector that require bees for pollination. So with those few comments, I'll take my seat, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I recognize the member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I briefly want to take a minute and talk about this Bill number 173, an act respecting the bee industry. And as my colleague has said, certainly seems like good legislation. Certainly beekeeping is, or the act of making honey, I guess, is an old and ancient food source that goes back to the time of the Egyptians, and for centuries and millennium people have been making honey. And certainly I guess my experience with bees or beekeeping is probably as a retailer. I used to own a farm market and used to buy honey from different producers. I remember in particular the Foote family farm in the Annapolis Valley in Kings County. Used to buy a lot of liquid honey and congealed honey after it had hardened up in various sizes of bottles. Even honeycomb in a square flat container was a popular item with some people, and beeswax candles. So there's a variety of items that were available through Foote Family Farm, and they use the bees, of course, in their apple industry to pollinate the crops. And today, bees are used generally across Nova Scotia for pollination, important in the blueberry industry and the apple industry, and really anywhere vegetable crops or fruits or vegetables that we need pollination. I've had a look through this bill, Mr. Chairman, and there's it seems to be a common sense bill. As my colleague had mentioned, it might be a little difficult to get everybody on side, especially those that have one hive or two, or maybe just as a backyard hobby. And it may be intrusive in that respect. They may feel their private hobby is being invaded, and they have to now go through some red tape, some government regulation. That might be a drawback to getting everybody on board, but the fact that there's no fee might make it certainly easier. But looking through the bill, I see where the primary focus is to prevent disease and pest problems from occurring, and protect the industry, really, and protect consumers. If, God forbid, if disease or pests were to take control of the industry, then, maybe it would have to be greatly curtailed or shut down or reduced in its ability to not only be a honey maker, but to certainly also to pollinate for agricultural crops. So looking through the bill, I see most things in there that are common sense. It describes what disease or pests are, and if everybody registers and everybody comes on board with this, then it should make sense. It gives powers to the inspector to come in and look at the bees and the bee making equipment. And if he or she should find a problem, then they have the authority to ask the beekeeper to fumigate or to correct the problem, and failing which they have the right to destroy or get rid of the hives, and so they may not spread. And I suppose the beekeeper or the inspector would have to make sure that if he's going to another beekeeper or to a colony elsewhere, then you have to also make sure he's clean and fumigate or disinfect himself as well. That's about it, Mr. Speaker. I think it's a good bill, and I, like my colleague, support Bill 173, and I urge it go on, and we'll let it go on to the next stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Do the clauses carry? Does the title carry? Does the bill carry? It is carried. Recognize the Government House Leader.
Mr. Chairman, I move that your committee to now rise and report these bills.
Recognize the Government House Leader. Oh, yes.
Chairman of the Committee of the Whole House on Bills reports that the committee's met and considered 3 bills, 153, 168 and 173. Chairman's been instructed to recommend them to the favorable consideration of the House, each without amendment except Bill 153 with amendment.
Will these bills be read for a third time at a later date? Recognize the Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Would you please call private members' public bills?
Private members' public bills.
Would you please call Bill number 179?
Bill number 179. Recognize the Honourable Member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm extremely pleased to rise and speak for just a few minutes on Bill number 179, the Self-Managed Attendant Care Act. Mr. Speaker, it was 10 years ago that self-managed attendant care started as a pilot program under the previous Liberal government. And it was 6 years ago, Mr. Speaker, that the Premier, the current Premier, stated that a government under his leadership would ensure that the right care is offered at the right place at the right cost for the right reason. So, Mr. Speaker, today it's fitting that we debate a bill that ensures that an example of such a successful program will become a permanent program of government. Mr. Speaker, for the individuals residing in the Halifax Regional Municipality who have been involved in a pilot program since its inception, their lives have improved. That's been shown, Mr. Speaker. This bill ensures that disabled individuals, as of December 31st of this year, irrespective of where they live, will have the same opportunity as those in that pilot project, Mr. Speaker. When you have a program that improves the quality of life and reduces costs, minimizes the number of visits, for example, to emergency rooms, prevents people from being improperly admitted to healthcare institutions, then that kind of a program can be nothing short of a winner, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would also like to recognize the efforts of the MLA for Annapolis in bringing forth and championing this issue and recognizing the importance of such legislation, not only to his constituents, but to all Nova Scotians as well, Mr. Speaker. Today, we have the opportunity to do a great thing in passing this bill. If we do that, we will ensure a province-wide self-managed care program with sustained funding. Mr. Speaker, an elimination of this program cannot happen without approval of this legislature, and Mr. Speaker, we view that as positive. Most importantly, however, is the message we send to all disabled individuals who will qualify for self-managed care. In 6 months' time, irrespective of where you live, there will be guaranteed monies available for you to access a self-managed care program. This is money, Mr. Speaker, that cannot disappear, and by passing this bill today, we as legislators would guarantee that the self-managed care program remains a permanent program of government. Mr. Speaker, we have managed to move a great program forward, and we are proud as a Liberal caucus to have played an integral role in such a vital program. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I'll recognize the member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I certainly want to speak to Bill 179, the Self-Managed Support Care Act. And Mr. Speaker, I want to tell you that when I came to this Legislative Assembly as a first elected MLA back in 1998, I happened to become the critic for community services and persons with disabilities for our party. And it was during that period of time that I recognized the lack of services being provided to disabled persons by the province of Nova Scotia, and not only by this particular government of the day, but previous governments as well. Although I will acknowledge that the self-managed attendant care came in under the Liberal government through a pilot project where some 10 individuals, in fact, were the fortunate recipients of taking this pilot project on and being the benefactors of being able to manage their own care. I think that we in government don't recognize strongly enough the importance of individuals who are disabled of becoming independent and to become as independent as possible. Even though you may have a severe disability, does not detract or take away from your need to be as independent as other members of our society. And the self-managed attendant care program allowed that to happen, Mr. Chairman, or Mr. Speaker in this case. And the reason I say that is because then individuals, for the first time in their lives, could set their own agendas and their own programs as to when they needed that self-managed attendant care and when that care could be provided. And Mr. Chairman, I want to say that they even were able to go through the hiring process of being there to evaluate and assess the individual whom in fact would be their caregiver and providing that self-managed attendant care. I want to say that this structured their lives on an everyday basis and allowed them to be able to set their own agenda with respect to the activities that they may become involved in over that 24-hour period, over that week, over the years. So the self-managed attendant care program had been extremely successful. I want to say, through the pilot project, I want to say as well, Mr. Speaker, I thought that when I came to this legislative assembly being somewhat green and not